come and introduce my colleague, Jeff Timberlake, who is an associate professor in the sociology department. He came to UC in 2003 after getting a PhD from the University of Chicago and a master's from the University of Wisconsin, which are two great places to get sociology degrees. And he studies urban sociology and race and ethnicity, and he uses a quantitative approach to do this work and focuses especially on patterns and inequalities in residential settlement. He is a very productive colleague. He has 17 peer-reviewed publications, yay, as well as some other publications, grant activity, everything that the college wants in one of its faculty members. And as a colleague of Jeff's, I have to add that a great thing about having Jeff in our department is that he is a very good departmental citizen as well. He works with a lot of graduate students, is on a lot of committees. I've been on committees with him. He's a great person to be on a committee with. And in the best show of being a good departmental citizen, voluntarily took the place of one of our new assistant professors who is overburdened with service work this year and took her place on a committee. So yes, so we are glad to have him here. And I look forward to his talk today, talking about just what I suggested his work was about patterns of minority suburbanization in U.S. metropolitan areas.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank all of you for showing up on this blustery but lovely fall day. I have two stories that I always tell my students about how I got interested in the topics that I'm interested in. And this is one of them. I grew up in Milwaukee, which is about 90 miles north of Chicago, right on Lake Michigan. And when I was in high school in the mid to late 1980s, I played in a club volleyball team down near Racine, Wisconsin, which is it's not quite a suburb of Milwaukee. It's a little further away than a suburb, actually. And so we'd get in our cars and we'd drive all the way down I-94, and we'd get off at exit 333. Now, exit 333 is not particularly notable for any reasons other than the fact that when I was getting off at exit 333, there was nothing there except a single Burger King and a single gas station. So this was, 23 years ago, and the only things there were these two businesses, a Burger King and a gas station. I remember it well because we'd get gas and food when we either be coming or going. And when I was in college at the University of Michigan and then later at Chicago, I would drive this route back up to my parents' house, and we'd go by exit 333 all the time. And I started noticing over the years that it looked a lot different over time. In fact, today, this is a Google map, well, the satellite imagery of that same exit. And here is the Burger King right there, right? It's still there. But look at all the other stuff that's there. We have a golf course. That wasn't there when I was there in high school. We have a number of warehousing and small production manufacturing plants that have sprung up there. There's some housing up here that you can see. There's just a whole bunch of other stuff, car dealerships, outlet stores. There's a huge amount of stuff that's there. So between 1987 and, let's say, 1995 or so, the picture of that exit utterly transformed from really just a way station for people driving to a place where people actually went and shopped and bought cars and built things and did all kinds of stuff. And so early on that got me to thinking about how is it that cities have grown and transformed spatially over time. So the big questions that I'm asking in a project that I'm doing with my graduate student Aaron Howell, I should have mentioned him earlier, we're asking about the spatial distribution of populations and how that's changed over time within metropolitan areas. So in this project, we're not so interested in, for example, the growth in populations in the Sun Belt or something like that. We're talking about within metropolitan areas, how has the population shifted over time. And we're particularly interested in characteristics of the population with respect to their race and ethnicity, and the changing distribution of affluence and poverty in American metropolitan areas. We're also interested in trying to understand why populations have shifted. What are the factors of metropolitan areas that have led to them, their populations being redistributed over time? And some, again, obvious things that we're interested in is how has the effect of the composition of the population, particularly their race and ethnicity and their socioeconomic status, how has that altered where people are living in metropolitan areas? And finally, the other big piece of this is to think about how suburbs themselves have changed, or at least the suburban rings of metropolitan areas have really grown over the last 30 years. In addition, since about 1970, a much greater percentage of employment in metropolitan areas is located in the suburbs. And how has that drawn population into the suburbs and altered how people are living? So those are kind of the big questions. The smaller question for this talk has more to do with understanding how minorities have changed in their suburbanization patterns over time. Suburbanization is thought by many demographers and sociologists to be an important indicator of what sociologists refer to as spatial assimilation, which is essentially the idea that in order for minority groups, particularly immigrant groups, to sort of become integrated into the larger structures of American society, one of the prerequisites for that is that they have to be spatially assimilated or located in areas where there are non-minorities or whites located. The other reason that suburbanization is important is because it has implications for residential segregation, as I'll talk about in just a minute. For a long time in the US, minorities, particularly African Americans, were heavily concentrated in central cities of American met areas. And so to the extent that they're spreading out now throughout metropolitan areas into suburbs, that has implications, at least theoretically, for how they might be becoming more residentially integrated. There's also a concept in economics and sociology known as spatial mismatch, which has to do with the idea that if jobs are increasingly located, especially low-skill jobs are increasingly located in suburban areas, then if minorities continue to be concentrated in central cities, this will put them at a disadvantage in either hearing about employment opportunities or certainly getting to them. It's pretty hard to get to a job 30 miles away from you if you are poor and live in the inner city. So that suburbanization has implications for that as well. There's a lot of research on minority suburbanization. What we found is that there's a couple of, I wouldn't say problems, but at least limitations that the research suffers from. One is that there's not a whole lot of research that takes a longer view. A lot of the research either looks cross-sectionally, at one time point, or it looks maybe between two censuses and sees how things have changed between, let's say, 1990 and 2000. So we're taking a longer view and looking from 1970 through 2000. The second problem that a lot of research has faced is that it tends to treat the suburbs as all one thing. Just anything that's not the central city is thought to be the suburbs. And anybody who knows anything about suburban areas in any major metropolitan area knows that there's a lot of variability in those suburbs. Some are rich, some are poor, some have a lot of minorities in them, some don't. And so there isn't a lot of work that looks carefully at how suburbs differ from each other. So that's one of the things we're doing in this paper. And related to this is a question that we noted in doing some of the background work for this project. And that is that there's an awful lot of, it's usually at the tail end of a paper that looks at suburbs just as one big block of places. And it sort of will say things like, well, minorities are becoming more suburbanized, but they're all clustered in the inner ring. That is to say, the group of suburbs that's adjacent to the central city. And this might be problematic for people who live in those places because they tend to be suburbs that are older, that are probably undergoing some of the same kinds of problems that central cities have undergone with respect to aging housing and possibly some manufacturing industry that has left for further flung suburbs. There's some work that suggests that increasingly inner ring suburbs are functioning more or less as just the extension of central city ghettos. So in Cincinnati, you might think about a suburb like Reading or something as functioning like that. In Chicago, there's a suburb called Cicero, which is on the west side, which is largely poor and Hispanic now. There's a suburb called Harvey in Chicago on the south side that's largely African American and largely poor. So in some sense, the argument is that there's been this sort of spillover of ghetto populations from the central city into these inner ring suburbs, and as a result, they're not facing particularly better residential circumstances.